There are certain moments in life that arrive quietly, without fanfare or warning, and you only recognize them for what they are later, much later, when you're sitting alone in the dark and the weight of everything finally settles on your chest. My moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the sitting room of my mother's semi-detached house in Allerton, Liverpool, when I picked up a thin packet of cardstock that was supposed to represent 29 years of her love for me. 3 pages, someone else's baby on the cover, and in the background, visible through the doorway, a 206-page scrapbook sitting on the coffee table like a monument to everything I was not. I want to tell you something before we get into this. I want you to understand that I am not by nature a man who keeps score. I don't lie awake replaying slights. I don't build cases against people I love. That's not who I am, and it's not who I was raised to be, or at least it's not what I tried to be, even when the raising itself was part of the problem. But there comes a point in every person's life when the evidence accumulates to such a height that you cannot in good conscience pretend it doesn't exist. When the pattern becomes so clear that denying it would be a kind of dishonesty all its own. I'm Marcus Chen. I'm 29 years old. I grew up between 2 worlds. My mother's English family in the leafy, quiet streets of Allerton, and the ghost of my father's Chinese heritage that lived in my face and my name and nowhere else, because my mother had moved past that chapter of her life before I was old enough to understand there had been a chapter at all. I grew up loved, I think. I grew up fed and clothed and present at Christmas dinners and school plays, but I also grew up understanding, somewhere deep below the level of conscious thought, that I was a secondary character in the story my family was telling about itself. The primary character was Emily. Emily, who is 2 years older than me, and blonde and bright and bubbly, who laughs easily and cries prettily and has always known exactly how to fill a room. Emily, who got the surprise parties and the handwritten birthday cards with the long paragraphs inside and the phone calls just to check in. Emily, who my mother spoke about with a particular softness in her voice, a warmth she reserved specifically for Emily, the way you reserve a good wine for special occasions. The rest of the time you drink whatever's open, and the rest of the time that was me. I don't say this to be harsh. I say it because it's true, and because the truth is the only thing I have left to offer after everything that happened in that kitchen on a Saturday afternoon that I will never entirely forget. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the scrapbook. The scrapbook was just the evidence. The story starts 18 months earlier, in my studio flat in Liverpool's Baltic Triangle, on a Wednesday night, when I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the 3rd investment offer to cross my inbox in 9 months, and thinking, they still don't know. Not my mother, not Emily, not my Aunt Sandra, or my cousin Bethany, or any of the people who had sat at Sunday dinners over the years and either pitied me or ignored me, or most commonly, talked enthusiastically about Emily's marketing career while I quietly refilled everyone's glasses. They didn't know because I hadn't told them, and I hadn't told them because I wanted to see what they would do. You have to understand the state I was in when I made that decision. I wasn't some chess grandmaster plotting his revenge. I was a 27-year-old man sitting in a converted warehouse space in one of Liverpool's most creative and chaotic neighborhoods, staring at numbers on a screen that told me I had become, quietly and without anyone's permission, genuinely successful, and the feeling that rose in me alongside the satisfaction wasn't pure pride. It was something more complicated than that. It was a question. The question was, if they find out now, how will they react? Will they celebrate me the way they celebrate Emily? Will my mother's face do the thing it does when Emily walks into a room? That involuntary brightening, like someone turned a lamp on behind her eyes? Or will it be the same careful, pleasant neutrality she offered me, the same distracted smile, the same, "that's nice," love, before she turned back to the conversation she actually cared about. I needed to know. I needed to know who they were when they thought I was still nobody, because that would tell me everything. So I kept quiet, and I watched. The Baltic Triangle had been good to me. If you've never been to Liverpool, and if you haven't, you're missing something real. You should know that the city contains multitudes. There's the waterfront, grand and historical, the old Mersey docks that built empires, the Liver building standing watch like it's been there since time began. There's the Georgian Quarter, all cream-coloured elegance and wrought-iron railings. There's the football, always the football, and the music that seems to rise out of the pavements themselves. And then there's the Baltic Triangle, which is where Liverpool goes to reinvent itself. Old warehouses converted into studios, murals on every wall, coffee shops that become project spaces, that become performance venues, the smell of roasting beans and fresh paint and possibility. I had moved there 3 years earlier when I was 26, into a studio flat that was barely larger than a decent hotel room. I'd set up a desk by the east-facing window and started working before the city woke up. I want to tell you, it was glamorous. It wasn't. It was months of cold mornings and budget lunches and 18-hour days staring at code until the letters stopped making sense. It was learning, constantly learning, because the technology consulting space doesn't care about your feelings. It cares whether you can solve the problem. And I could. I always could. I just never had anyone paying attention long enough to notice. The company I built wasn't a flashy thing. It wasn't an app or a social media platform or anything designed to trend. It was a technology consultancy focused on something unglamorous and essential: supply chain analysis. I had developed a proprietary software system that allowed mid-sized businesses to automate the analysis of their supply chain data in ways that previously required entire teams of analysts. It was, in the dry language of investment reports, a significant operational efficiency tool with strong scalability potential. In plain English, it saved companies a lot of money, and they were willing to pay me well to implement it. My first client was a food distribution company in Birkenhead. They'd been hemorrhaging money on inefficiencies they couldn't even identify. I spent 3 weeks mapping their operations, built a prototype of my system, and showed them how they could save £40,000 a year within 18 months. They looked at me across a conference table, this 26-year-old who'd showed up with a laptop bag and a pitch deck, and they took a chance. That chance became everything. That chance was not given without friction. I want to be honest about that. There were 3 weeks between the first meeting and the signature on the contract, and in those 3 weeks I rewrote my proposal 4 times and answered 42 questions by email and attended 2 follow-up meetings at 8 in the morning in a conference room that smelled of instant coffee and someone's breakfast. The operations director, a rigorous woman named Helen, who had spent 20 years in logistics and had the particular skepticism of someone who'd been sold empty solutions before, interrogated every assumption in my model. She was the best thing that could have happened to me. "Show me what happens when your algorithm encounters incomplete data," she said at the second meeting. "Here," I said, and I had the scenario ready because I had anticipated the question. I showed her. The model adapted. The efficiency loss was minimal. She looked at the screen for a long time. Then she looked at me. "You built this yourself?" "With a lot of late nights." "How many?" "More than I'd care to count." A pause. "How old are you?" 26. She turned back to the screen. "That's fine." And she said, and her tone made clear that what she meant was, "That's impressive, but I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of saying so directly," which suited me because I understood that kind of person. I'd been raised in a household where the currency of recognition was scarce, and I'd learned early to read its indirect forms. She signed the contract 8 days later. I drove home that evening through the Birkenhead tunnel with both hands tight on the wheel and a feeling I hadn't anticipated, not triumph, but confirmation. Something I had built worked. Someone had trusted it enough to bet money on it. After Birkenhead, I spent 6 months refining the software and another 3 months building a case study. A careful, rigorous document that quantified exactly what I'd done for the food distribution company. With their permission and with the numbers verified by a third-party accountant, I paid £800 I didn't entirely have. The case study was 12 pages long. I sent it to 41 businesses in Liverpool and Manchester who I'd identified through industry databases as likely to have the supply chain inefficiencies my system was designed to address. 12 replied. 3 became meetings. 2 of those meetings became contracts. The third meeting was with a textiles manufacturer in Salford, and it was there that I encountered James. He hadn't been invited to the meeting. He worked for the company in a technical capacity, and someone had mentioned the meeting to him offhandedly, and he'd shown up anyway, sitting at the back with a laptop he never opened, asking 2 questions that were so precisely targeted at the architectural weaknesses in my system that I spent the drive home partly exhilarated and partly unsettled. He had emailed me before I reached the motorway. You have a gap in your redundancy protocol for 3-tier supply chains with seasonal variation. Here's how I'd fix it. 3 lines of code followed. Elegant. Correct. I pulled over on the M62 and read it twice. Then I called the number he'd signed off with, which I suspected was bold enough to get me in trouble and turned out instead to get me a business partner. James Chapman was 31, Salford-born, the kind of programmer who understood systems with an intuitive depth that was genuinely rare, and who had been, by his own account, thoroughly miserable doing corporate tech support for a company that had no interest in letting him solve interesting problems. He was laconic and precise and had an absolute zero tolerance for overselling anything, which made him, in some ways, the perfect counterbalance to the parts of this work that required me to be persuasive and optimistic and good at dinners with people who needed to feel confident before they committed their company's resources to an idea. "I'm not a salesman," he told me, at the pub in Salford where we had the first real conversation. "I don't need a salesman," I said. "I need someone who can build the things I can't build alone." "What are you paying?" I told him the number, which was not much because it was the number I honestly had available. He looked at his pint. "Equity, 20%. A longer pause, then, "Right, fine." We shook hands across a table covered in the rings of 100 previous glasses. It was not a dramatic moment, but in the strange arithmetic of my life, it may have been one of the most significant handshakes I'd ever given. Because the thing James understood immediately, without my having to explain it, was that what we were building was real. Not aspirational, not potential-laden, not one day going to be something. Real. Right now. With evidence and numbers and Helen's signature already on a piece of paper and 2 other companies paying monthly retainers. He understood it because he'd seen the software, and the software told its own story. Some things don't need a salesman if they actually do what they claim to do. James was the one who told me about 18 months into our partnership with characteristic directness. "You know you're going to need to hire people." "I know." "You going to tell your family before or after you do?" I'd looked at him for a moment. After, I think. He had accepted this without asking further questions, which was one of the things I valued most about James. He understood that some things had their own timing, and that my reasons for the timing I chose were mine to hold. Because once you have one client who's made money using your work, you have a story to tell. And in the business world, a story supported by numbers is the most powerful document in existence. By the time I was 27, I had 7 clients. By 28, I had 11. By the morning of Emily's engagement party, I had 14, spread across Liverpool and Manchester, paying me a combined average of £18,500 per month. I had one full-time employee, James, my business partner and lead developer, a quiet Mancunian genius who had somehow agreed to come work for me after seeing a post I'd made on a developer forum. I had the beginnings of something real, and I had documentation, so much documentation. I want to tell you about the documentation because it's important to understand why I had it and what it represented. It wasn't sinister. It wasn't a dossier I was building to destroy my family with. It started as something much smaller. A note in my phone, one evening after my birthday, when I lay in bed trying to identify the feeling sitting in my chest. I was 27. I had just had a birthday. 4 people had come to dinner at a curry house on Allerton Road, the same Indian restaurant we'd gone to for every low-effort occasion since I was 15. My mother had been one of the 4. She'd left at 9:15, explaining that she was tired and had an early start. I found out 2 days later, via a Facebook post, that Emily had had a surprise party that same month, not the same day, a different weekend, but close enough to sting. 60 guests. A 3-tiered cake from the expensive bakery in Woolton that I'd walked past 100 times and never been inside. A photo booth, a slideshow. My mother in the photographs with an expression on her face that I recognized as pure joy, unguarded and total. The kind of expression I catalogued carefully because I so rarely saw it aimed in my direction. I opened my phone notes that night and I wrote, "Birthday. Curry house, 4 people. Mum left early, said, tired. Emily's party, 60 people, Woolton cake, photo booth." I didn't know then that I was starting something. I thought I was just processing. But the notes kept accumulating because the pattern kept presenting itself with a consistency that demanded acknowledgement. Family dinner where Emily's promotion was toasted with actual champagne. I'd signed my biggest contract to date that same week, and when I mentioned it, my mother said, "That's nice," and asked Emily to tell everyone more about her new responsibilities. The Christmas, where Emily received a cashmere coat and pearl earrings, and I received Amazon vouchers and a selection box. The Sunday phone calls my mother made every week to Emily that became every other week when Emily got busy. But at least there were phone calls. My mother called me when she needed something, someone to drive her to the airport, someone to check if the boiler was under warranty, someone to fix the Wi-Fi when Emily wasn't available. I noted all of it, not in anger, or not only in anger. I noted it because I wanted to understand something true. I wanted to know whether my perception was accurate or distorted, whether I was telling myself a victim's story that wasn't actually justified, or whether the thing I had always half suspected was genuinely, provably real. By month 6 of the documentation project, I knew. I had 43 entries. I had cross-referenced them. The pattern was not ambiguous. You know what I also documented? The moments when my mother was kind to me, the times she asked if I was eating properly, worried aloud about me working too hard, sent me home from Sunday dinner with a Tupperware container of leftovers. I documented those too because I wanted to be fair, because I needed to know whether what I was observing was absence of love or presence of hierarchy, whether she loved me less or simply loved Emily differently, more loudly, more visibly, more consistently, in the ways that actually count when you're a child, trying to understand your place in the world. The answer I arrived at, after 18 months of quiet observation, was this: she loved me. But Emily was her masterpiece, and I was everything else. Sitting with that answer was one of the stranger experiences of my adult life. I had set out to understand something, and I had understood it, and the clarity brought neither vindication nor relief. It brought something closer to grief, with its edges worn smooth. The kind of grief that has been processed so many times it no longer has the power to surprise you, only to sit heavily when you let yourself feel its full weight. She loved me, she was my mother, and she loved me. And Emily was her masterpiece, and I was everything else. And both of these things were simultaneously true, and neither cancelled the other out. I thought about my father during those months in ways I hadn't permitted myself to do since childhood. Michael Chen had left, or been asked to leave. The story was different depending on who was telling it, and I had learned not to push when I was 4. He had been present in Liverpool until I was 6, technically visiting me on scheduled weekends in an arrangement that I remembered less as visitation and more as a series of afternoons at the pierhead, feeding the pigeons and eating chips, his hand warm around mine, his voice low and unhurried. My memory of him was almost entirely sensory, the particular roughness of his jacket sleeve, the smell of the aftershave he wore that I could not have named but would still recognize if I encountered it, the way he laughed when something actually pleased him. Not the polite laugh he offered the world, but a real one, quiet and sudden. He had moved to Hong Kong when I was 8, a job opportunity that my mother had mentioned flatly, in the way she mentioned anything connected to him, which suggested that she had already moved past it before it happened. I had gotten a card at Christmas every year until I was 14, and then the cards had stopped. I had his sister, Linda, and in her I had the thing that mattered most, the tangible proof that the chapter of my heritage that lived in my face had also produced specific people who were fully real and still present in my life. What I found myself wondering in the months of my observation project was whether my mother's particular blindness toward me was in some part a blindness toward what I represented. Not consciously. I was certain she had never sat down and decided to love me less because I looked like my father. But unconscious things operate below the surface. And below the surface of our family's story, there was a chapter she had closed as firmly as she could. I was what remained of that chapter, visible in every mirror, audible every time someone mentioned my name. Michael Chen, Marcus Chen. The syllables rhymed. I'm not saying she was punishing me for existing. I'm saying that when we direct our attention, we direct it somewhere, towards something, away from something else. And I had spent nearly 3 decades being the something she directed her attention away from, whether it was because of what I looked like, or because of some earlier calculus about which child needed less, or simply because of the particular chemistry of personality that drew her toward Emily in a way that felt like recognizing herself. I couldn't be certain. Maybe she couldn't either. What I was certain of was this: her reasons were hers, and my response was mine. And my response had been 18 months of quietly, carefully watching and documenting and building something that would stand regardless of whether anyone was watching. I was sitting in my car outside my mother's house in Allerton when that realization fully crystallized. November, nearly a year into my observation period, a Sunday afternoon after dinner. The houses on that street all looked the same from the outside. Brick, modest gardens, net curtains, wheelie bins tucked neatly alongside the paths. My mother's house had a hanging basket by the door, dead flowers in it from the summer, which she hadn't gotten around to replacing. Inside, she was washing up. Emily had already driven back to her flat in the Rope Walks area, a flat my mother had helped her redecorate and referred to as our project. My mother had never seen my studio. She'd been invited twice. Something always came up. I sat in the car for 11 minutes. I noticed the time. And then I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I decided to keep watching. I decided to build the business. I decided to wait until the moment when the favoritism became impossible to ignore, impossible to excuse, and then I would show them everything. Not for revenge. I want to be precise about this, because revenge is a small word for something that was never small in my chest. It wasn't revenge I was after, it was truth. I wanted the truth to be visible. I wanted to look my mother in the eyes and have her understand, clearly and without escape, what she had missed, what she had decided wasn't worth her attention. I wanted her to know that while she was decorating Emily's life with gold ink and pressed flowers, I was becoming someone extraordinary, and I wanted to be standing in front of her when she realized it. The announcement of Emily's engagement party arrived at a Sunday dinner 6 weeks before the event itself. Emily and Christopher had gotten engaged on a trip to Edinburgh. Christopher had proposed at the top of Arthur's Seat, which even I had to admit was romantic in a cinematic sort of way. The family had celebrated appropriately. My mother had cried. I had hugged Emily and shaken Christopher's hand and smiled with genuine warmth, because I do love my sister. Whatever complicated feelings I carry about how I was raised, Emily is not the villain of this story. She never knew. That matters. But it was at that same Sunday dinner, 6 weeks before the party, that my mother made her announcement. I remember the light in the kitchen, the way it comes through the west-facing window in the late afternoon, warm and slightly golden. I remember the smell of the roast chicken she'd made. I remember my mother's face as she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos with an energy I recognized. The Emily energy, the particular brightness she reserved for anything connected to her daughter. "I'm making something really special for Emily's engagement celebration," she said, and her voice had that quality it gets, soft and full, like she's speaking from somewhere deeper than usual. Her eyes were actually glistening. A complete history of her life, every achievement, every milestone, every precious memory. I want it to be a gift she'll have forever. I watched her fingers move across her phone screen. I watched Emily beam. I watched Christopher look politely interested in the way future in-laws do when they're still auditioning. And then I said, casual as anything, setting my fork down with a small clink, "Did you ever make one for me?" The pause was half a second too long. "Of course, love, years ago, when you were small." She didn't look up from her phone when she said it. That was the tell. My mother is not a practiced liar. When she tells a truth she believes, she looks at you. When she says something she knows is not quite true, her eyes find something else to do. "I'd love to see it sometime," I said. "I'll look it out," she said, still scrolling. I picked up my fork, continued eating, let the conversation flow around me the way it always did, with Emily at the center and me at the pleasant, unremarkable edges. I knew she was lying. I had never seen any scrapbook. I had grown up in that house, had spent 18 years in my childhood bedroom, had helped move boxes when she downsized after Emily left for university. I had never seen a scrapbook with my name on it. There was no scrapbook. What I didn't know yet was what she'd do about it, whether the lie would remain a lie or whether guilt would prompt her to action. I found out on the morning of the engagement party, 47 days later. Let me tell you about those 47 days, because they're important. I know it was 47 days because I counted them. Not obsessively. I didn't cross off days on a calendar like a prisoner. I counted them afterward when I was doing the math, because my mother had told Emily at that same Sunday dinner that she was going to start the project immediately. "I want to give it everything," she'd said. "Every night after work I'll do a few pages. I want it to be perfect." And the party was in 6 weeks, which is 42 days, and she'd started 4 or 5 days before that, which makes 47. 47 days she worked on Emily's scrapbook. You need to understand what Emily's scrapbook actually was before I tell you about mine, because the contrast is the story. Emily's scrapbook was, and I say this without any sarcasm, purely as an objective observation, genuinely beautiful. I'd arrived early to help set up, and it was sitting on the coffee table in my mother's sitting room, and I stood there for a few minutes just looking at it before anyone else arrived. 206 pages. I counted, not all at once. I flipped through, slowly letting the pages turn. Cloth-covered boards in deep burgundy, the kind of cover that looks expensive because it is. Emily's name, embossed on the front in gold foil. Inside, my mother had used a variety of paper stocks, cream card, textured ivory, a few pages of translucent vellum overlaying photographs. The captions were handwritten in gold ink, a consistent, careful hand that must have taken significant effort to maintain across 200 pages. There were pressed flowers from Emily's first school play, mounted under clear acetate, fabric swatches cut from every birthday dress Emily had worn between ages 3 and 14. My mother must have kept them all, stored in a box somewhere, waiting. Emily's acceptance letter to the University of Liverpool, not photocopied but the original, mounted on cream card and matted with a thin gold border. A pocket on page 163 that held Emily's swimming certificates in chronological order, each one labelled in my mother's handwriting with the date, and Emily's personal best time, report cards, friendship bracelets, a dried corsage from a school dance, ticket stubs from concerts and theatre productions, pages upon pages of photographs, each one captioned, dated, contextualized. I sat down on the sofa with it on my lap, and I turned the pages, and somewhere around page 80, Emily at age 12, gap-toothed and triumphant at a gymnastics competition, a red ribbon pinned to her leotard. I felt something inside me go very still and very quiet. Not angry, not yet, just still. 47 days, every night after work, every precious memory. My own scrapbook was on the breakfast bar in the kitchen. I found it almost by accident, turning to go pour myself a glass of water. It was sitting there, separate from everything else, which in retrospect was its own kind of statement. Kept apart from Emily's monument, unworthy of the same table, 3 pages of thin cardstock, the kind you can buy in a multi-pack at the Tesco Express down the road. No cover, no binding, just 3 sheets, creased slightly from being slipped into something, a rubber band around them to keep them together. I picked them up. I looked at the first page. There was a baby on it, a beautiful baby, plump-cheeked and smiling, with red hair and pale skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. I looked at that baby for a long moment. Then I held the page up to the light, as if a different angle might reveal something I was missing, as if this might somehow be me. I have my Chinese father's coloring, dark hair, dark eyes, the particular cast of features that has meant my entire life, that people sometimes assume my mother is my nanny, rather than my parent. That baby in the photo was not me. That baby was not any child my mother had ever given birth to. I had the sense, studying the soft, generic backdrop behind the child, that this might be the sort of image that comes included with a photo frame when you buy it at a home goods store. A filler, placeholder, someone else's child, printed and inserted because there was a space to fill, and my actual baby photographs were apparently not accessible. She hadn't checked. In 47 days, she hadn't checked. The second page had my secondary school graduation photograph. Just the photograph, no caption, no context, no matting or border or gold ink. The photo I recognized. I was 16 in it, standing in the school car park in my uniform, squinting slightly because the sun was in my eyes, and I had the expression of someone who had agreed to the photograph purely to make someone else happy. The third page had a newspaper clipping about a cricket match. I don't play cricket. I have never played cricket. I looked at the clipping, which was from a local paper, and I found the name in the caption. Marcus Chen, age 17, had scored 43 runs for his school. I did not go to that school. The Marcus Chen in the photograph had features I didn't recognize as my own. I stood in my mother's kitchen, holding 3 pages of thin Tesco cardstock, looking at a stranger's baby and another man's cricket triumph. And I did the arithmetic. 47 days for 206 pages, 1 frantic hour. Probably that morning. Probably while Emily and I were expected to arrive. Probably with her phone in one hand and the cardstock in the other, pulling up a generic baby photo and a random newspaper clipping and calling it done. Not done, not even begun. I set the pages down carefully. I poured my glass of water. I went into the sitting room and sat in the armchair by the window and watched the street outside, where people were parking their cars and walking toward the house in their party clothes, carrying wrapped presents and bottles of Prosecco. I sat there for perhaps 4 minutes, feeling very calm. The kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from resolution. When you have spent 18 months building toward a moment, and the moment arrives with even more clarity than you anticipated, there is a particular stillness that settles over you. I sat in that armchair and looked at the street and let myself feel what there was to feel, because I had learned the hard way that the thing you don't let yourself feel doesn't disappear. It relocates. It finds somewhere else to live, somewhere less visible, and from there it shapes your choices without your awareness. I had spent too many years making choices shaped by a grief I wouldn't acknowledge. I wasn't going to do it now, not when the truth was this clear, not when the evidence was sitting on the breakfast bar in 3 sheets of Tesco cardstock. What I felt was grief. There it was, plain and honest. Not rage, not humiliation, not even the particular acid burn of feeling vindicated in the worst possible way. Grief. Because the thing I had always half suspected and had documented for 18 months and had tried to quantify into something manageable was, on the level beneath the numbers and the observations, simply this: my mother had not thought about me. While she was making something beautiful for Emily, working 47 days with consistency and care and gold ink and pressed flowers, she had not once, not in the whole 47 days, thought to pull out whatever photos she might have of me, or write down a memory she had of something I'd done, or look at a blank page and think, my son would like to see this. I didn't exist in those 47 days, not to her. I was the person she'd have to think about if she thought about it, which she didn't. I had the thin cardstock on my knee. 3 pages, someone else's baby, another man's cricket glory. My face in a parking lot, the year I finished school, looking into the sun and squinting, with no context given and no story told. This was my history. According to my mother, this was the depth of the chapter she'd written about me. 3 sheets and a rubber band, and an afternoon of not caring enough to check whether the photograph was of the right child. I folded the pages carefully. The way you handle something that has become significant, not for what it is, but for what it proves. Placed them on the side table. You know. You knew before, but now you know. My mother appeared beside me with the energy she got when she had guests to manage, bright and slightly breathless. Oh, you're looking at Em's book. She was radiant. Genuinely radiant, the way she gets when something she's worked hard on is being appreciated. Do you love it? I've been working on it since Christmas. Every night after work I'd do a few more pages. I wanted it to be perfect for her. I had the thin cardstock in my hand still. I held it up. Yeah, mine's great too. I turned it so she could see the baby on the cover, red-haired and beaming. Though I think this baby might be from a stock photo. My mother's face did something complicated. It's the only way I can describe it. Several emotions competed for the same real estate. Guilt, embarrassment, defensiveness, and the particular expression of someone who has been caught and is now deciding how to play it. Well, you know, she said, I couldn't find your baby photos in the moment. In the 47 days you worked on Emily's? Marcus. Her voice sharpened, the way it used to when I was a child and pushing something she didn't want to examine. Don't make this about you. Today is about your sister. There it was. I had heard that phrase in one form or another for 29 years. Don't make this about you. As if wanting equal treatment was a form of selfishness. As if noticing the discrepancy was bad manners. as if the correct response to being handed a stranger's photograph and 3 pages of cardstock was to smile and be grateful for the gesture and redirect your attention back to the person who received 206 pages of gold-inked devotion. I looked at my mother. I thought about the 47 days. I thought about the notes in my phone. I thought about the birthday curry and the left early tiredness and the article in Business Liverpool that had been scrolled past in favor of photographs of Emily's new flat. I thought about 18 months of careful watching, and I smiled. I set the scrapbook down on the side table gently, like it was something I intended to return to. "You're absolutely right," I said. "Today is about Emily." My mother relaxed. The tension in her shoulders released. She patted my arm and moved away to greet new arrivals, and I stood in the sitting room of my childhood home and understood that the next few hours were going to be, in their own quiet way, the most significant of my life. The party filled the house the way parties do, suddenly and completely, the way a tide comes in. One moment there were a dozen people, and the next there were 73, which I knew because my mother had mentioned the count twice on the phone in the preceding week, each time with pride. 73 people come to celebrate Emily's engagement. She'd said it the way someone reports a personal achievement, as if the head count itself was evidence of something wonderful. And it was. It was evidence of Emily's place in the family's narrative. Central, celebrated, the occasion worthy of coordinating the schedules of 73 people on a Saturday in March. My 29th birthday had been 4 people at a curry house in Allerton. My mother had left at 9:15. I had driven home alone and sat in my car outside my flat for a few minutes before going in. I moved through the party the way I'd learned to move through family events, pleasantly, invisibly, useful when needed. I opened wine bottles and pointed people toward the kitchen and answered questions about where to put their coats. I spoke to cousins I hadn't seen in months and Christopher's family, who were cheerful and kind and clearly delighted about the engagement. I watched my mother work the room with Emily at her side, the two of them moving through the crowd like a matched set, and I catalogued what I observed with the particular clarity of someone who has been paying close attention for a very long time. My mother touched Christopher's arm with easy affection when she introduced him to people. She'd known him 11 months. She asked detailed questions about his work. He was a solicitor, property law based in Manchester, and listened to his answers with genuine interest. She laughed at his jokes. She refilled his glass without being asked. She introduced him not as Emily's fiancé, but as our Christopher, that possessive warmth already in place, already established. I had dated Zoe for 3 years. We'd broken up 8 months ago, amicably, the way you break up when you've grown in different directions rather than apart. Zoe had been a nurse at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. Every time my mother had mentioned Zoe, which was rarely, she'd called her that girl you're seeing, regardless of how long we'd been together. I don't believe she ever knew which ward Zoe worked on. I had told her twice, once at a Sunday dinner, once in a phone call. Both times she had moved past it without retention. I was standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water. I'd stopped drinking at these events about 6 months in, when I realized I needed to stay sharp to observe accurately, when my Aunt Linda appeared at my elbow. Linda is my father's sister, my connection to the side of my heritage that lives in my face but not in my daily life. She's in her mid-50s, small and fierce, with sharp eyes that have always made me feel seen in the way I most needed. "You look like you're doing equations in your head," she said, "just thinking." She looked at me for a moment with those sharp eyes. "About how your scrapbook looks like a school project someone did on the bus?" I laughed, despite myself. It surprised me, the genuine laughter. "You saw it? Hard to miss. It's sitting on the breakfast bar like evidence." She sipped her wine, a proper Cabernet, not the house Prosecco. "Your mum means well." I looked at her. "No," she said after a beat. "You're right. She doesn't. She means well toward Emily. She studied me. You've been very quiet lately, not posting on Facebook. Your mum said you've gone a bit private. Her words, bit private. The way she said it made clear what she thought of the framing. Something like that. How's the work going? Linda had always asked about my work. It was one of the things I loved most about her. The genuine, detailed interest. She remembered things I'd told her. She asked follow-up questions. Good, I said. And then, because it was Linda, and because I trusted her with something, if not with everything, really good, actually. She looked at me with the particular attention of someone putting a picture together. Feels like you're waiting for something. I met her eyes. Maybe I am. She nodded, slowly, as if this confirmed a theory she'd been developing for some time. Your dad was like that, she said, patient. He'd let things develop until he understood them completely before he acted. People used to mistake it for passivity. She took another sip of wine. It wasn't passivity. Aunt Linda had this quality I had thought about often over the years, the quality of making her attention feel like sunlight. Not the burning, demanding kind of attention that makes you feel observed, but the warm, steady kind that makes you feel held. She had come to every birthday that mattered, not the big ones necessarily, the quiet ones, the ones that fell on weekdays when nobody could make it to a proper dinner. She'd turn up with a bottle of something good and sit in my flat and ask me exactly what I'd been up to, and then listen to the answers. She remembered the name of my first client. She'd asked 4 months after I'd mentioned Birkenhead in passing how things were going with the food distribution people. And Duchess, I had stopped for a moment when she'd said that, had stared at her for a full 2 seconds, recalibrating something. They renewed, I'd said. Good, she'd said simply, as if this was exactly what she'd expected, as if she'd always known it would go well. That's what witnessing looks like, not the performance of interest, but the actual practice of it, the retention and the follow-up, the acknowledgement that the things people tell you about themselves are worth carrying forward, that the small details of someone's life constitute a kind of map, and if you pay attention to the map, you start to know where they've been and where they're going and whether the road is kind to them or not. My mother had never asked about the food distribution people. My mother had never retained the name of a single client or project I'd mentioned in the years since I'd started building the business. Not because she didn't love me, because she hadn't been paying attention, because the part of her attention that could have been directed toward me was already fully occupied. I had learned to accept Linda's witnessing the way you learn to accept warmth when you've been cold for a long time. First with surprise, then with gratitude, and finally with something that felt almost like settling, like finding the right temperature and letting your body believe in it. She was not a replacement for the thing I hadn't had, but she was real and consistent, and she had always been there. We stood together for a moment, and I felt something ease slightly in my chest. This was the gift Linda gave me simply by existing, the reminder that I came from someone, that whatever my mother had decided to do with my father's chapter in her life, that chapter had produced me, and I was not a mistake. I was not quantity. I was not the footnote. I was someone's son, fully and genuinely, even if the someone in question was more present in my features than in my days. Proud of you, Linda said quietly, and then she moved away to talk to someone else, leaving me standing by the window with her words sitting in my chest like warmth. The party moved through its rhythms. Food was served, cleared, replaced with cake. Prosecco was poured repeatedly. People grouped and regrouped in the way of parties, the social geometry shifting every 20 minutes. I moved through it all, and I waited. The speeches began at 4:30. Christopher went first, standing in the doorway between the sitting room and the hall where he could be seen from both, holding his champagne glass with the confidence of a man accustomed to speaking in professional settings. He was charming and brief, and clearly genuinely in love with my sister, and I liked him better in that moment than I had before. He spoke about meeting Emily, about knowing within a few weeks, about the proposal at Arthur's seat in the November wind, while she'd been convinced they were just out for a walk. Emily, hearing this retold, pressed her hand over her mouth and cried in the pretty way she has, and the room made the warm sounds rooms make at such moments. Then my mother stood up, Patricia Chen, she'd kept my father's name, which had always struck me as one of the more complex details of her relationship with her past, was 54 years old, and she looked younger. She had the kind of blonde that requires maintenance, but that she maintained with commitment, and the particular posture of a woman who had decided long ago how she wanted to present herself to the world. She was holding her champagne glass in both hands, and it was trembling slightly. Genuine emotion, I knew my mother's tells. And she looked out at the room full of people who had come to celebrate her daughter, and her face was lit with pure, uncomplicated joy. I stood against the wall near the door. I put my hands in my pockets. I waited. My mother began to speak about Emily, the way she always spoke about Emily, with a fullness, a completeness that made it clear this was where her deepest investment lived. She spoke about Emily's birth, the first moments, the particular shade of blonde she'd had as a baby. She spoke about Emily's childhood, her brightness, her determination, her talent for making friends. She spoke about Emily's career, her flat, her taste in clothes, her ability to walk into a room and make everyone feel immediately welcomed. 5 minutes in, she said it. Emily has always been my greatest joy. From the moment she was born, I knew my life had purpose. Being her mother has been the best thing I've ever done. The room made warm, appreciative sounds. Someone behind me murmured, "Oh, that's lovely." A cousin wiped her eyes. Christopher was watching with an expression of sincere gratitude. I stood against the wall and I waited, because I knew my mother, and I knew this wasn't over. She continued, getting more emotional now, her voice doing the slight catching thing it does when she's genuinely moved. She talked about what Emily meant to her, what it had meant to watch her daughter grow into the woman standing in front of her, and then she paused, a performer's pause, and her eyes swept the room, and she smiled with the warm, self-deprecating smile she uses when she's about to say something she thinks is charming. I know some people have more than one child and love them all equally. Scattered laughs. Someone near the kitchen gave a knowing chuckle. I felt the room lean in slightly, anticipating the punchline. But I've always said, quality over quantity. More laughs, louder this time. The room was delighted. The room found this charming and witty and endearing, because the room was not me. I was standing 12 feet from my mother. I was one of her 2 children, and she had just told 73 people in a speech at a family celebration that having me, the other child, the quantity, had been the lesser offering, that Emily was quality, that the arithmetic of her children produced 1 winner and 1 filler. Emily, you are everything I ever hoped for in a daughter. The applause started immediately, genuine and warm. Someone whistled. Emily crossed the room and put her arms around our mother, and they held each other while the room watched with the particular sentimentality of people who feel they have witnessed something precious. I was aware of Linda's hand finding my arm. "Marcus!" Her grip was firm. Linda's grip is always firm, the grip of someone who means it, and she was watching my face with an expression that I recognized as containing calculation. She was deciding something, whether to say more, whether to step in, whether this was a moment that required her active involvement or only her steady presence. "Your mother doesn't know what she just did," Linda said quietly, close to my ear. Around us, the applause was still going. Emily and Patricia locked in their embrace, Christopher photographing the moment. "She does," I said. "She just doesn't know I was listening." Linda pulled back slightly to look at me. "That's the difference," she said, "isn't it? She's never thought you were listening." She said it without cruelty, as an observation, the way Linda says most things. And it was precise. It was exactly right. My mother had spent 29 years operating in the sincere belief that I was present, but not paying close attention, that I occupied my place at the family table without accumulating information, without building a record, without noticing the architecture of the preferences that shaped every gathering. She had thought I was there the way furniture is there, present, functional, not watching. I had been watching. I had always been watching. There was something almost clarifying about the moment after the applause died and the room shifted back into its social geometries, and I stood there with Linda's hand on my arm and the full knowledge of where I was and what I had in my pocket and what was going to happen in a kitchen shortly. No more hypotheticals, no more wondering if I was building the pattern from partial evidence. No more asking myself whether the hurt was real or constructed or outsized, or whether I owed it more grace and patience and charitable interpretation. The evidence was complete. The pattern was closed. The next move was mine, and I knew precisely what it was. "It's fine," I said. My voice was steady. My breathing was steady. Inside, something had shifted, not shattered, not collapsed, but moved. Definitely and finally, into a new position. Really, it's fine. Because it was. Not in the sense of acceptable, not in the sense of painless, but in the sense of, I understand now exactly what I needed to understand, and I know exactly what comes next. I waited with a patience that surprised even me. I waited through the applause and the hugging and the photographs. My mother and Emily posed together while Christopher played photographer, while cousins wanted their turn, while the Lord Mayor-style progression of the celebration continued unabated. I watched it all with the calm of a researcher at the end of a long study, seeing the results confirm the hypothesis. Not triumphant, not vindicated in any satisfying way, just clear. I waited until Emily opened her gifts. I watched my mother cry, properly cry, shoulders shaking, when Emily opened the scrapbook and began turning pages, exclaiming at each one, calling Christopher over to see the photos of her younger self. I watched my mother hold Emily's hand as they looked at page 63 together, whatever was on page 63 producing another fresh set of tears from both of them. I watched, and I felt the full weight of those 47 days, every single one of them, every night after work, every carefully captioned photograph. I waited until the room had settled into the post-gift opening drift, people refilling drinks and finding seats and sliding into comfortable conversation. I waited until my mother was in the kitchen arranging leftover cake onto a plate, alone for the moment, her back to the door. Then I went in. "Mum." I kept my voice light. "Normal. Can I show you something?" She turned, distracted, still in the aftermath of her emotional afternoon, her eyes slightly swollen from the good kind of crying. "What's that, love?" I opened my phone. I pulled up the banking application. I turned the screen toward her without a word and held it steady. She looked at it with the expression of someone who assumes they're being shown something trivial and is allocating attention accordingly. Then her eyes focused. Then I watched the focus sharpen into something else. She squinted slightly. Her gaze tracked across the numbers on the screen. Moved to the right, moved to the left, came back. Her eyebrows lifted. "This isn't—" She stopped, started again. "This can't be your account." "It is. There's over £2 million in here. 3 million, actually." My voice was calm, clinical, the researcher presenting findings to a subject who is also the variable. "That's the current valuation of my company. 3 firms have made offers. I'm reviewing them this week." My mother's mouth opened, closed. The word came slowly, like she was retrieving it from somewhere unfamiliar. "Your company?" "The tech consultancy I've been running for 3 years. Since I was 26, the one I never mentioned because every time I talked about my work, you changed the subject. I didn't. You did. I said it without heat, without cruelty, simply as a statement of observable fact. Mum, I've documented it. I have notes from 47 different family gatherings over the past 18 months, where you asked Emily about her job and didn't ask me a single question about mine. That's not, you never said you were doing anything important. I opened my photos. I showed her the screenshot of my company website, clean and professional, the logo I'd spent 2 weeks perfecting, the client testimonials from businesses in Liverpool and Manchester that named specific results and specific numbers. I showed her the client list, the names she wouldn't recognize, but that represented real companies, real problems I had solved, real money they had paid. Then I showed her the article. Business Liverpool had run it 8 months ago. Under 30 tech entrepreneurs reshaping the city's commercial landscape. My photograph was prominent, standing in front of the Stanley Dock building, my name underneath, my company's name, a pull quote about supply chain automation that I'd worried was too dry for a lifestyle feature, but that the editor had insisted was exactly the kind of thing people need to know about. I had sent the link to my family's WhatsApp group the day it was published. I had watched the group for responses. I published this 8 months ago, I said, keeping my voice even. It was shared in the family Facebook group. You liked 3 posts that day, all photographs of Emily's new flat. You scrolled right past the article. My mother's face was doing something I'd never seen it do before. It was collapsing and defending simultaneously, 2 opposing forces working on the same material, and the result was an expression I didn't have a name for. Marcus, if you told me, I did tell you. I put the phone back in my pocket. I didn't need it anymore. I told you I was thinking about starting a business. You said I didn't have a head for it. I didn't mean... You said most small businesses fail in the first year. I recited it the way you recite something you've reviewed many times, not with bitterness, but with precision. You told me to stick with the steady work I had. What you meant was that you didn't believe I could do it, because you've never believed I could do anything worth noticing. That's not true, Mum. Something in the way I said her name stopped her. 1 syllable. And it carried 18 months of quiet certainty. I pulled up one more document. I had photographed every page of both scrapbooks before the party, mine and Emily's. 12 photographs of Emily's, capturing the scope and detail and craft. 3 photographs of mine, capturing the stranger's baby and the wrong Marcus Chen's cricket match, and the graduation photo with no caption and no date. I showed her both sets. You spent 47 days making 206 pages for Emily. I let the numbers stand in the space between us. You spent what looks like approximately an hour making 3 pages for me, and you didn't use my photograph. This baby, I turned the phone so she could see it, isn't me. This baby has red hair, Mum. You didn't check because you didn't care enough to check. I do care about you. You don't, not the same way. My voice remained steady, calm, and that's what I needed to know. What does that mean? Her voice had gone very small. It means I'm done waiting for you to see me. I held her gaze. I spent 18 months being quiet, watching what you do when I stopped trying to get your attention, when I stopped volunteering my achievements, stopped bringing up my work, stopped trying to redirect the conversation toward my life instead of Emily's. I wanted to know who you were when you thought I was still nobody. Marcus, please. And what you did was forget I existed, except as someone to compare to Emily, except as the quantity in your quality over quantity equation. She flinched. The word landed exactly where I intended it to land. That speech, I said. That was the line, Mum. Quality over quantity. You said that about your children. You were speaking about your children, both of them, one of whom was standing 12 feet away. And you chose that phrase. I didn't mean it like that. You did. And even if you didn't, you said it. And you didn't think for a single second about how it would feel to me, because you weren't thinking about me at all. I let that settle. That's the truth of it. Not cruelty, not hatred, just I wasn't in the room for you, even when I was standing in it. Her tears were spilling over now. I can fix this. I can make a proper scrapbook. I don't want a scrapbook. My voice went soft, genuinely soft, the sharpness going out of it, leaving something that was closer to sadness than to anger. That's the thing you're not understanding. I never wanted a scrapbook. I wanted a mother who was curious about my life, who asked questions and remembered the answers, who saw me walking into a room and felt something light up in her. That's not about a scrapbook. It never was. That's about 29 years of not quite mattering. Patricia reached for me. Her hand found my arm, the familiar gesture, the mother's gesture. I didn't step back, but I didn't move forward. We stood there in the kitchen of her Allerton house, with the sounds of the party filtering in from the sitting room. Someone had put music on, something cheerful and completely wrong for the moment. And I looked at my mother and I saw her, maybe for the first time, clearly and fully. Not as the woman who had failed to love me equally, not as the architect of my accumulated grief, just as a woman who had made choices, unconscious or otherwise, and who was now standing in the kitchen of her own house, looking at the consequences. She was not a monster. She had never been a monster. She was something harder to name and harder to forgive, a person who had decided, without deciding, that one of her children was worthy of her full heart, and the other was worthy of what was left over. From my jacket pocket, I took the envelope. I set it on the counter between us. That's an invitation to the launch party for my company's new office. We're expanding, taking on 12 new employees. The Lord Mayor's coming. There'll be press. I watched her look at the envelope, like it contained something she wasn't sure she deserved to open. You're welcome to come, but I need you to understand something first. She looked up at me. I don't need you to be proud of me anymore. The words came out quiet, and they were the truest words I had spoken in years. I needed that when I was 16 and 19 and 23. I needed it at every family dinner where I wanted to tell you about something I'd built and didn't, because the attention was somewhere else. I needed it on my birthday in that curry house, and on every Christmas morning, and every time you called me to ask if I could fix something, rather than just to talk. I needed it for a long time, Mum. I don't need it now. I didn't miss. You missed all of it. I held her gaze. All of it. The tears came harder then. She pressed her free hand to her mouth, the gesture of someone trying to contain something that won't be contained. I can make this right. Can we start over? She whispered. I thought about it. I thought about it genuinely, not as a performance. Turned the question over the way you turn over something you found on the ground to see whether it's worth keeping. No, I said finally, but we can start different. I gestured to the envelope on the counter. Come to the launch if you want. The address is in there, the date, the time. Bring Emily if she wants to come. But come because you're genuinely interested in what I've built, not because you feel guilty, not to make yourself feel better in front of people who will be watching, because you actually want to know who I am. I do know who you are. You know who you decided I was when I was born and complicated your life. The words didn't come out unkindly. They came out the way true things come out when you've stopped being afraid of them. You know the version of me that fit neatly into the story you were already telling. You don't know who I've become. I crossed to the breakfast bar, picked up the 3-page scrapbook, my scrapbook, the evidence, thin as an apology, thinner than a receipt. I held it in one hand. I'm taking this, I said, not to punish you. That's not what this is. I looked at the baby on the cover one more time, that red-haired stranger with someone else's history, and then I looked at my mother. But someday I might have kids of my own, and I want to show them what can happen when someone doesn't really see you, so they know to never accept that from anyone, so they know that they're allowed to notice. I walked toward the kitchen door, then I stopped, because there was one more thing, and it needed to be said plainly, without decoration. The speech was the line, Mum. Quality over quantity. That was the thing that made silence impossible. And even if you didn't mean it the way it landed, even if you'd never say it again, you said it once, in front of 73 people, and you didn't hesitate, because you weren't thinking about me at all. "I'll do better," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "I hope you do," I said. "I genuinely do." I left the kitchen. Linda was waiting by the door. She had my coat over her arm. She'd retrieved it from the pile on the bed in the spare room without my asking, because Linda has always understood what I need without my having to articulate it. She looked at my face, whatever was in it, and she didn't ask questions. She just held the coat, and then, when I'd put it on, she pulled me into a hug, a fierce one, the kind that says everything that can't be said in a room full of people. "Proud of you," she said against my shoulder. "Your dad would be too." I held on to that for a moment. Then I pulled back and looked at her. "Come to the launch?" "Obviously." She released me. "Now go, before someone comes and turns this into something it doesn't need to be." I left my sister's engagement party at 5:23 in the afternoon by my car clock. The drive from Allerton to the Baltic Triangle takes 18 minutes when the traffic is reasonable, and the traffic was reasonable, and I drove it with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the city moving past my windows in the early spring light. Liverpool was doing what Liverpool does in the late afternoon in March, the light going golden and soft over the old brick terraces, the Mersey visible in flashes between buildings, everything slightly shimmer with the particular quality that city has when it's trying to remind you that it's beautiful. I parked. I went upstairs. James looked up from his laptop when I came through the door, and I could tell from his expression that something in how I was carrying myself communicated that the day had been significant. "How was the party?" he said. "Educational." "That bad?" "That clarifying." James had the particular quality of knowing when to ask more and when to let something be. He looked at me for a moment, his laptop half closed, and then he closed it fully and turned his chair to face me, which was the signal he used when he'd decided we were going to have an actual conversation. "You showed her," he said. "I showed her. And now she knows." I took off my jacket and hung it on the back of my chair. Her face was... I paused, trying to find the right word. It did something I hadn't anticipated. I'd been preparing for that conversation for months, but the actual moment was different from how I'd imagined it. She looked... I thought about it. Diminished. Not in a satisfying way. In the way that someone looks when they realize they've missed something they can't recover. James was quiet for a moment. "Good or bad, that?" "Both." I sat down. "Neither. It was just true." James had known, in general terms, about the situation with my family. I hadn't given him the full documentation. He was my business partner, not my therapist, and there were limits to what the working relationship needed to absorb, but he knew enough. He knew that my family had no idea what we'd built. He knew I'd chosen not to tell them. He knew from occasional observations he'd made over 3 years of working together that the reason was more complicated than privacy or modesty. "She going to come?" he asked. "The launch." I thought about it. "I don't know. I hope so." I pulled my laptop toward me. "But I'm not going to engineer it. She knows the details. It's on her." James nodded slowly. Then he reopened his laptop and turned back to his screen. Because that's what James does. He gives you exactly the conversation you need and then goes back to the problem at hand. It was one of the things I respected most about him. "For what it's worth," he said without looking up, I'd have paid to be in that kitchen. I know, I said. I sat down at my desk, pulled the laptop toward me, opened the spreadsheet I knew best, the one that tracked our growth metrics in clean, unambiguous numbers. Revenue up 340% year over year, client retention at 96%. Employee satisfaction scores averaging 4.7 out of 5 from a team that was about to triple. I had built this. I had built this in the margins of my family's attention, in the spaces they weren't looking, in the hours of every day that they'd never thought to ask about. I had built it while my mother was working on Emily's scrapbook, and while my birthday party was 4 people at a curry house, and while the family WhatsApp group was reacting to photos of Emily's flat with strings of heart emojis. I had built it while they were deciding who I was, which meant I had been free, entirely free to decide who I actually wanted to become. My phone buzzed. Emily. Mum's crying. What did you say to her? I looked at the message for a moment, then typed back, the truth. 3 dots appeared. Then, she said something about your business. You have a business. For 3 years. Why didn't you tell anyone? I set the phone down on the desk and looked at James's question in my head. I had typed and deleted 3 different responses. The honest answer was the simplest one. I picked the phone back up. I did. Nobody asked follow-up questions. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, I'm sorry. I set the phone face down on the desk. Sorry was something. Sorry was a beginning, small and fragile as any beginning. It was not a solution, and it was not an end, and it did not undo the 29 years that preceded it. But it was not nothing either. I turned the phone over again after a few minutes and looked at Emily's message. I read, I'm sorry, and the 3 dots that had appeared and disappeared twice before it, the evidence of words she'd considered and deleted before settling on the plain thing. That said something. Emily's impulse, when she was uncomfortable, was to explain, to soften and contextualize, and offer the mitigating circumstances that made the situation more complicated than a simple assessment would suggest. She'd inherited that from our mother, the instinct to manage how things landed. She had overridden that instinct tonight. She had said, I'm sorry, without appending anything to it, and I thought about how much that small act of restraint had cost her. There's something I need to tell you about Emily, because the account I've given of our family doesn't do her full justice, and that matters. Emily had benefited from what I hadn't received. That was true, but she had done so without knowledge, which makes her a recipient rather than a participant. Nobody had sat her down and explained the arrangement. Nobody had needed to. The arrangement operated below the level of explicit decision. Our mother had not chosen to love Emily more because she'd decided I was worth less. She had simply followed her attention, followed whatever current in her drew her toward Emily, the way it drew her toward certain rooms, certain conversations, certain ways of spending her time. Emily, in the middle of all that directed love, had grown into someone who genuinely didn't know what I'd been experiencing. I was certain of that in the way you're certain of things you've observed closely over years. She had always been warm to me, always included me in conversations, always made sure the birthday card had something personal written in it, rather than just a printed message. She had done everything a sister can do to connect across a dynamic she didn't know was tilted. She had simply never noticed the tilt. She'd been too comfortable in the center to perceive the edge. That's not her fault. It really isn't. The fault belongs to the person who created the tilt and maintained it, consciously or not, for 29 years. Emily was its beneficiary, not its author. The distinction mattered to me, and it would matter more going forward, because I was not interested in converting my mother's favoritism into a grievance against my sister. I was interested in clearing the air, not enlarging the damage. My sister was not a villain. My sister had grown up in the same house I had and had received what she received, probably without fully understanding the arithmetic of it, probably without knowing that her windfall was partly my deficit. She had been loved fully and freely and consistently, and that was not her fault. The fault lay elsewhere, in choices that were made before Emily and I were old enough to understand that choices were being made. I put the phone face down and opened the growth metrics spreadsheet and spent the next 2 hours reviewing the numbers for our expansion presentation, the one I'd be giving to 3 different investment partners in the following 10 days. The new office space at the converted Stanley Dock building was secured, the deposit paid, the renovations scheduled. 12 new staff positions were posted, with more than 200 applications already received. The Lord Mayor of Liverpool had confirmed his attendance at the launch, and the invitation list stood at 150 people, including clients, employees, investors, journalists, and my family. All of my family? I had sent invitations to all of them. I wasn't sure who would come. I'd thought about this in the quiet of the weeks leading up to the party, turning it over with the same methodical attention I gave to business problems. Some of them would come because they felt guilty, some because they were curious, some because the Lord Mayor and the press made it an event that felt foolish to miss, some, perhaps, because they actually wanted to understand who I'd become. It didn't matter in the end why they came. What mattered was that they would see it, all of it, the full scope of what I'd built while they were looking elsewhere. The 4,000-square-foot office in one of Liverpool's most storied buildings, the one that had once been a tobacco warehouse in the Victorian era and was now being reimagined again by someone who saw its potential. The team I'd assembled, talented and committed and proud of what we were building together, the clients who would be at the launch, who had believed in me before anyone in my family had thought to ask what I was doing with my time. They would see it, and then they could decide what to do with that information. I was not going to manage their response for them. I was not going to call my mother the next morning and soften the conversation we'd had. I was not going to call Emily and reassure her that everything was fine. I was not going to spend the next 11 days carefully curating how my family was processing the revelation of who I'd become. I had spent 18 months doing the emotional labor of managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own truth. I was finished with that particular job. What I would do was work. What I would do was finish the expansion planning and review the investment offers and ensure that the launch party was exactly what it needed to be, a statement, clear and specific, about what could be built in the margins of other people's attention. 11 days later, the Stanley Dock building was dressed for the occasion. The events team had done something with the lighting that I hadn't fully anticipated. The old industrial space, all exposed brick and iron rivets and enormous windows looking out across the waterfront toward the Wirral, was transformed into something that felt both historically grounded and genuinely contemporary. The Liverpool waterfront at night is one of the most remarkable sights in the north of England, and our windows faced it directly, the Liver building lit and magnificent across the water, the Mersey dark and moving below. 137 of my invited guests came. The Lord Mayor arrived at 7 on the dot, attended by his secretary and a quiet dignity that lifted the room slightly. Journalists from 3 local outlets and 1 national technology publication were present. Our 14 existing clients were represented by senior contacts at nearly every company. The 12 new employees we were onboarding were there, slightly wide-eyed, I thought, at what they'd gotten themselves into, which I considered a positive sign. My family arrived in a group at 7:15. My mother, Emily and Christopher, Aunt Sandra and her husband, 2 cousins, and Aunt Linda, who had come in a green dress and an expression that contained equal parts pride and something that might have been vindication. I watched them come through the door. I watched them look up. I watched their eyes move across the space, the size of it, the quality of it, The brass placard beside the entrance that read the company name I'd chosen 3 years ago in my studio flat. Chosen because it meant something to me, and because I'd always intended it to be real. I watched my mother's face. She stopped just inside the door. Emily had taken her arm. I noticed that Emily holding her, the roles slightly reversed from their usual configuration. My mother looked at the room, at the people in it, at the waterfront visible through the tall windows, and her face did something I had not seen it do since I was very small. It cracked open. Not in the way it cracked in the kitchen at the engagement party, not the collapsing and defending expression of someone caught. It cracked open the way a person's face does when they understand. Suddenly and fully and without protection, something true. When the gap between what they assumed and what is actually real becomes visible in one overwhelming instant. I gave her a moment, then I crossed the room. "You came," I said. "I came." Her voice was different from how it had been 11 days ago. Quieter. Something in it had changed or was still changing. The way things change when you've had 11 days to sit with a truth you'd been avoiding. "I'm glad." I meant it, Marcus. She put her hand on my arm, the same gesture as the kitchen, but different, lighter, tentative, asking rather than claiming. "This is..." She looked at the room again, at the team I'd built, at the Lord Mayor talking to James near the presentation wall, where we'd mounted a visual history of the company's growth. At the wall of client names, each with a brief description of what we'd solved for them. "This is extraordinary. Thank you. How did you..." She stopped, started again. "I didn't know, I didn't..." She was struggling with something, and I waited. "I didn't ask. I should have asked." "Yes," I said, "you should have. Can you tell me now?" Her eyes found mine, and in them was something I had waited a very long time to see. Not guilt, which I had no interest in, not shame, which is self-directed and doesn't help anyone, but genuine curiosity, the real thing. The thing I had watched her offer effortlessly to Emily and Christopher, and even the strangers at family parties, turned now toward me. Her son, the unexpected one, the complicated one. The one she'd been figuring out how to look at for 29 years. I took a breath. Then I began to explain. I told her about the idea 3 years ago in my studio flat, about the supply chain problem I'd identified because I'd spent 2 years in a support role, watching businesses struggle with it. About the software I'd built over 14 months of evenings and weekends and all-nighters, the proprietary system that had become the foundation of everything. About Birkenhead, the first client, the £40,000 they'd saved. About how one client became 2, became 7, became 14, each one a problem I'd solved, each one a trust I'd earned. I told her about James, who I called over and introduced properly, and who shook my mother's hand and said something genuine about what it had been like to watch the company grow. And I watched my mother listen to him the way she'd never listened to anyone talk about me before. Emily was beside her now. Emily, who had texted, "I'm sorry," 11 days ago, and had not, I noticed, made that apology smaller with explanations or context. She stood next to our mother and listened. She looked at the wall of client names, and the growth metrics displayed on the presentation screen, and the 12 new employees who had chosen this company out of 200 applicants. And she did something that surprised me. She said quietly, "I had no idea, Marcus. I really didn't." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was the same question she'd asked by text, and I had the same answer. But standing in this room, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built, I could give it more fully. I mentioned it once, at Sunday dinner, about 6 months in. I said I was thinking about trying some consulting work. You were telling Mum about a campaign you were running at your job, and it got absorbed into that. Nobody asked a follow-up, so I stopped mentioning it. Emily's expression was uncomfortable with a specific quality, the discomfort of someone recognizing their own behavior in someone else's description of it. "I'm sorry," she said again. And then, after a pause, "I'm going to do better, if you'll let me." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant that too. Linda found me later in the evening, when the room had found its rhythm and the champagne was being refilled for the third round, and the Lord Mayor had said all the right things and gone home and the journalists were finishing their notes. She stood beside me at the window, and we looked out at the waterfront together, the Mersey black and fathomless below, the lights of the Liver building reflected in its surface. "How do you feel?" she said. I thought about it, really thought about it, the way I had been doing all evening with the various things that were requiring my honest attention. "Like something's finished," I said, "and something else has started." "Good kind of finished?" "Yes." I looked out at the water. "I think so." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your dad would have loved this building. He had a thing about Victorian industrial architecture. Said it was the most honest kind of building because it wasn't designed to impress anyone. It was designed to do a job." I smiled. "I chose it because it used to be a warehouse," I said, "something that stored other people's goods before anyone thought to make it into something of its own." Linda looked at me. "Was that deliberate?" "Maybe a little." She laughed, that sharp, unexpected laugh of hers. "Your father's son." The party wound down the way good parties do, gradually and warmly, people finding each other for final conversations, collecting coats, pausing to shake hands, or exchange cards, or offer genuine, specific compliments about the space and the company and the trajectory. I stood near the door and accepted all of it. And it felt different from how compliments had felt before, not because they were more effusive, but because they were grounded. They were responding to something real, to something I had actually built, not something I'd been given or inherited or stumbled into, something I had constructed deliberately and persistently in the margins of other people's attention. My mother was one of the last to leave. She had spent most of the evening in conversation with James, who I noticed had handled her questions about the company with the patient thoroughness he brings to all technical explanations. At one point, I'd passed close enough to hear her saying, "But how does the algorithm actually work?" and James explaining it in plain terms, and my mother nodding with the particular focused nod of someone genuinely trying to understand. Not performing interest. Actually having it. At the door, she held my hands in both of hers and looked at me for a long moment. "I owe you more than I can say tonight," she said. "I know that. And I know that one conversation and one party doesn't undo anything." She was choosing her words carefully, I could tell, trying to say exactly what she meant, rather than what would sound best. "But I want to try. I want to ask you the questions I should have been asking for years, if you're willing." I looked at her, my mother, 54 years old in her good dress, at the entrance to my company's new office, trying to find her way towards something she'd been missing for a long time. "Call me," I said, "not to ask if I can fix something, just to talk." "I will. And when I tell you something about work or a project or something I'm thinking about, ask a follow-up." "I will," she said again. I believed her. Not completely, not yet. Trust doesn't rebuild in a single evening any more than it erodes in one. It builds in the accumulation of specific small acts over time, in the consistent presence of genuine attention, in the follow-up questions and the remembered details and the phone calls made for no reason, except wanting to hear someone's voice. I knew that. I'd spent 18 months learning what its absence looked like. I knew exactly what it looked like when it was present. We would see. The future was not promised, and I was not in the business of promises I couldn't keep. But I was in the business of building things. I had proven that. and I was willing, if she was, to see what might be built from here. I drove home alone along the waterfront, the Mersey on my left, the city on my right, Liverpool doing its late-night thing. Buses still running, a few figures on the pavement, the old buildings standing in their undemonstrative permanence against the sky. I had the windows down, despite the March cold, because I wanted to feel the air. The actual air of this city that had absorbed my ambition and my frustration and my determination and had given them back to me in the form of something real and lasting. On my passenger seat under my jacket was the 3-page scrapbook, The Stranger's Baby, the wrong Marcus Chen's cricket match. The graduation photo without a caption or a date. I had carried it out of my mother's house 11 days ago, and it had sat on my desk ever since, face down, because I didn't particularly need to look at it, but present because it was evidence of something I wasn't ready to put away. I thought about what I'd told my mother, that I'd keep it to show my children someday if I had them, so they'd know. So they'd understand with specificity that there are people in your life who may love you and still not see you, and that the failure to be seen is not evidence of your unworthiness, but of their limited attention. So they'd know they were allowed to notice when they weren't being seen. So they'd know it was possible, necessary even, to build your life in the truth of your own worth, rather than in the hope of someone else's recognition. Someday, I would show them. I would hold those 3 thin pages and tell them what they represented. And then I would show them the photographs from the launch party, the Stanley Dock building lit against the Liverpool night, the Mersey visible through the tall windows, the room full of people who had come because of something I had built, and I would tell them, this is what you can do in the spaces where people aren't looking. This is what grows when you stop asking for permission to matter and simply start building something true. I parked outside my building, sat in the quiet car for a moment. The Baltic Triangle around me was doing its usual late-night thing. A few studio lights still on in the converted warehouses, the distant sound of music from somewhere, a cat crossing the pavement with the authority cats have in cities late at night. I thought about something Linda had said months ago, at the beginning of the observation period, before she'd understood fully what I was doing. She'd said, "Feels like you're waiting for something," and she was right. I had been waiting. I had spent 18 months in a particular kind of suspended animation, watching and documenting and building in the background, while the foreground remained occupied by other things, other people, the story my family was telling about itself that left me at the margins. I wasn't waiting anymore. There are 2 things I want to tell you before we close this out, because I think they matter beyond this specific story, beyond my specific family and my specific mother, and the particular arithmetic of one woman's love distributed unevenly across 2 children. The first is this: the desire to be seen by the people who were supposed to see you first is one of the most human desires that exists. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that parental recognition, not just love, but the specific experience of being truly witnessed, truly known, is foundational to how we understand our own worth. When that recognition is uneven, when it is calibrated differently for different children without anyone quite meaning to do it, the consequences live in the body and the mind of the less seen child for decades. They live in the way that child asks for things or stops asking, in the way they share achievements or stop sharing them, in the way they inhabit rooms, whether they fill the center or stay near the doors. I know this because I lived it, and I know it because the research says it plainly. But the second thing is equally true, and it is the one I want to leave you with. The absence of someone else's recognition does not equal the absence of your worth. These 2 things are not connected, even though for a long time, for years, honestly, I operated as if they were, as if my mother's attention was the instrument that measured my value, and its varying calibrations told me something real about who I was. They didn't. They told me something real about her, about the limits of her attention and the history that shaped her priorities and the unconscious choices she'd been making since before I was old enough to be affected by them. My value was never located in her perception of it. It existed independently, whether or not she was looking. And the proof of that is not the 2-3 million valuation or the 14 clients or the Lord Mayor at the launch party. The proof is the 18 months of quiet, sustained building that happened entirely without her attention. In the margins of a story she was telling about someone else. I didn't need her to see me to become who I became. I needed only to keep going. That is the thing I most want you to carry out of this story. You don't need the person who was supposed to see you first to validate what you're building. You need only to keep building it. The recognition, when it comes, will mean more if it's responding to something undeniable. But even if it never comes, even if the person who should have seen you first never quite manages to turn their full attention toward you, what you've built is still real. Still yours, still extraordinary. You built it in the spaces where they weren't looking, and it's more beautiful than they ever imagined you could create. If this story landed somewhere real for you today, if you recognize something in Marcus's patience, or in the particular pain of being the less seen child, or in the quiet determination it takes to keep building when nobody's watching, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this stayed with you. Was it the scrapbook, the speech, the moment in the kitchen? Or was it something else, something more personal that this story touched in your own life? Hit that like button if you think Marcus deserved better. Hit it if you believe that people who build in silence deserve to be seen when they're ready to be found. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We tell these stories every week, and every week we try to find the truth inside the complicated, messy, sometimes devastating and sometimes triumphant experience of family and worth and what it means to know your own value. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. There's something I find genuinely moving about the idea that this story is reaching people in different time zones, different circumstances, different family situations, all finding something recognizable in the same human experience. And on the screen right now, there's another story waiting for you, one that I think might be even more powerful than this one. It's about a woman who spent 12 years building something she was told she couldn't have, and the single moment when everything she'd sacrificed was either going to be worth it or not. I don't want to say more than that, because the moment when it lands should land clean. But if you liked this story, that one will not disappoint you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.